We are back on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio, News Talk, 1180, 1230, KGEO, 1410 KERI, and now in Albuquerque, New Mexico at 1000 KKIM. Mark Twain once said that truth is stranger than fiction, but it is because fiction is obligated to stick to possibilities, truth isn't. Our next guest wrote a book about one of the most incredible stories, I think, of World War II that very few people know about. Stephen Harding is the author of The Last Battle. Steve, welcome to Taking Care of Business.
Oh, thanks. It's great to be with you.
So I read a book review, and I just couldn't wait to talk to you about your latest book and this story. So this is a story where American and German soldiers are fighting on the same side.
Exactly. It's the only documented case in World War II where that happened.
Well, tell our listeners about The Last Battle and your book and what the story is all about.
The Last Battle, Marty, the story is about an event that took place on the 4th and 5th of May in 1945 in a castle in Austria. It's a part of Austria known as the Tyrol. It's the northern part of Austria, just south of the German border. The castle in German is called Schloss Itter. There's been a fortress in that position on that hilltop in Austria since the 9th century. Over the years, the castle was built up, so it's really, when you think of a castle in your mind's eye, you're going to be seeing Schloss Itter. When the Nazis took power in Austria, they took the castle over for use as a very special prison. The Germans established prisons throughout the Reich for what they called Ehrenhäftlinge, which means honor prisoners. These were the prisoners that were important enough to be kept in relatively good condition so that at some point they might be exchanged as hostages or used in some way to influence other nations. Castle Itter was made one of these special prisons, and in May of 1945, by that time there were 14 French prisoners held there, 10 men and 4 women. These prisoners included a couple of former prime ministers of France, Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, 2 former heads of the French army, a very well-known tennis star who'd been part of the Vichy government, and a couple of people who were there mainly because they were related to people the Germans were interested in. For example, one of the female prisoners was the sister of Charles de Gaulle. So they were all in Castle Itter in May of 1945, and by this time Hitler had been dead for several days, and things in that part of the world were very, very dicey, and that's sort of where our story begins.
Now, one other guest that I thought was kind of interesting was the son of the great World War I statesman in France, George, I always mispronounce his last name. Is it
Clemenceau?
Clemenceau. Right. So George Clemenceau's son, Michael Clemenceau, was also a prisoner in that castle as well, wasn't he?
He was indeed. And there was also a gentleman who, between the wars, had been one of France's leading right-wing political leaders, a gentleman named François de la Roque. The interesting thing about all these folks, Marty, is they all hated each other, these French people, because they had been political rivals, they'd been, in some cases, romantic rivals, and so the Germans, probably just as an extra little poke in the eye, put them all in one place. And for most of their incarceration in this castle, they actually refused to talk to each other. They'd walk down different sides of the hallways. They'd eat at different tables in the little dining area that they had. So it couldn't have been a happy atmosphere for these folks. So
being a prisoner in this castle as an honor prisoner wouldn't be that bad of a deal anyways, because here it is. It's a castle. You're really a VIP in effect. So was it tough being a prisoner in one of these castles?
Probably, certainly not as tough as it was for people in other German camps. There was no torture at Castle Itter. There was no work. These French VIP prisoners ate very well, considerably better than most prisoners. In fact, better than most German soldiers at that point. They spent most of their time milling around in the enclosed area that was sort of their exercise yard. And of course, several of these people spent a lot of their time writing memoirs that they hoped that after the war would excoriate the other people that they were imprisoned with. It was, all in all, if you had to be in a German prison, it was probably the best one you could be in.
Yeah. Our guest by phone, Stephen Harding, author of The Last Battle, a story of American and German soldiers fighting together. Okay, so we're setting up this scenario here. You've got this castle where you've got all these important French prisoners, and Hitler's dead, so you would assume that, it's been a couple days. You'd assume the war is over, but yet it's not for these people. What happened?
Well, Marty, it's true. The war is on the verge of being over, but it's not over yet. And in this part of Austria, you have to understand that the Germans had been retreating, obviously, as the Allies advanced. So a lot of German units were actually retreating out of Germany proper into this part of Austria called Tyrol. And it was a very dangerous place. Some of the units were trying to surrender. Some were still fighting. The roads are clogged with refugees. They're advancing Allied units. And in fact, the Allies are advancing from two directions, coming down from the north out of Munich, and from the west along the valley of the Inn River, which sort of bisects this part of Austria. So it was a very confusing place, very dangerous to be on the roads because you didn't know if you were going to get ambushed or if the Germans you saw in front of you were trying to surrender. I've always sort of described it as Fallujah with better scenery.
I like that description.
So why didn't, when they were retreating, why didn't they either kill or let these prisoners out?
The order had actually gone out, as we found out after the war. Himmler, who was obviously still alive at this point, had ordered a German Waffen-SS unit that was operating in that area and still relatively intact to go to the castle and kill everybody in it, not just the French prisoners, but also the German guards, had they still been there. They weren't there because the German guards, who were all from the same organization that guarded the concentration camps, knew that they didn't want to be around when the Allies showed up, and the Allies were certainly coming. So they took off on May 4th. And this, of course, meant that in one sense, the French prisoners were now free, except they were in extreme danger because, although they didn't know it precisely at that time, this Waffen-SS unit was coming to get them. But they knew that they were surrounded by troops that would possibly kill them at any moment. So they sent out two of their sort of servants on bicycles. These servants were prisoners from Dachau, who the Germans had brought to the castle to sort of take care of the VIPs. So these two gentlemen set out in different directions on bicycles, and their sole purpose was to find the nearest Allied unit and bring them as quickly as possible to the castle to secure it, so that the prisoners would be safe.
Well, again, this sounds like a movie more than, like a fiction, more than it does a nonfiction true story. So now all of a sudden they're free, but does a German unit come in there and protect them against the SS units that are approaching? Yeah, the way this happens is these two bicycle messengers, if you will, one of them heads off towards the west, towards Innsbruck, which is it's 25, 30 miles, depending on how you ride it. And he runs into some advancing American units, tells them this story. And an officer named John Kramers, who's a political officer, sets about setting up a rescue operation. But the other bicyclist had actually gone to a much closer village called Virgil. And there he runs into, believe it or not, a German officer, a German army officer, named Josef Gangl. His nickname was Sepp. So Sepp Gangl was a highly decorated German officer. He'd won the Iron Cross first and second class fighting the Russians, and the German Cross in Gold fighting us after Normandy. But as his unit had retreated, he finally got to Austria, and he decided the war was over, there was no point in continuing it, and he went farther than that. He decided to help protect the people around him, and he started giving arms to the Austrian anti-Nazi resistance. And when this bicyclist shows up, Gangl realizes he has to save the people at the castle. He doesn't really have enough men to do it, so he makes a very gutsy, sort of out-of-the-box decision. He jumps in his Kubelwagen with a big white flag, and he drives to a nearby village called Kufstein, where he finds the nearest American unit, which is a tank unit led by a gentleman named John Lee, or Jack Lee. And Jack Lee is the prototype of a tanker. He's a cigar-chewing, hard-drinking, hard-charger from upstate New York. And here's this German who appears out of nowhere with this tale of these French people who need to be protected. And Jack Lee, who I always sort of suspected was not real happy that the war was going to be over because he'd really found his niche as a soldier, says, okay, I'll help you, let's go get him. So they join forces, and after going back and scooping up some of Gangl's German soldiers, they head up to the castle with a couple of tanks.
one of which they drop off on the way to protect a bridge. So when they finally show up at the castle, the French come pouring out expecting that the cavalry has arrived. And they're a little disappointed to see that there are only about 10 Americans, 1 tank, and maybe 12 armed German soldiers. And when Jack Lee tells them he's there to protect them, I don't think they were too impressed.
For some strange reason. Well, let's pick up there when we come back from the break, okay?
Right.
We'll be back in a moment on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio News Talk 1180.